the Gospels, you probably think of parables, stories like the Good Samaritan or the Prodigal Son. They feel like the absolute core of Jesus' teaching, don't they?
And the whole point, we're always told, is that they're simple. They're these neat little stories designed to make a big moral lesson easy for anyone to understand. You know, just a straightforward lesson wrapped up in a memorable tale.
Okay, but what if that's completely backwards? Seriously, what if the whole point wasn't to make things clear at all? What if these stories were actually meant to be secret codes, designed to hide the meaning from almost everyone?
Now, that might sound crazy, but listen to this. This comes directly from the Gospel of Mark, the earliest one we have. Jesus is quoted as saying he speaks in parables specifically so that people on the outside won't understand and won't be forgiven. I mean, wow, that one verse just flips everything we thought we knew completely on its head.
All right, so let's dig into this first section, a secret teaching strategy, because this isn't just some throwaway line. Mark presents this as a deliberate strategy. So what on earth is going on here?
Well, what Mark is describing is basically a two-tiered system. It's like there's an inner circle, the disciples, and for them, the parables unlock the secrets of the kingdom. But for everybody else, the outsiders, the parables are meant to hide the meaning. It's almost like an exclusive club, and the parables are the secret handshake.
And you know, the key word Mark uses here in the original Greek is mysterion. Now, we hear mystery and think of a whodunit, right? But back then, it meant something totally different. A mysterion was a secret teaching, a hidden piece of knowledge that was only revealed to initiates, people who were on the inside of a group, like an ancient mystery cult. You had to be part of the club to get it.
And get this whole idea isn't something Mark just made up. He's actually quoting directly from the Hebrew prophet Isaiah. And in that original context, God is telling Isaiah to go deliver a message that will intentionally confuse people and harden their hearts as a form of divine judgment. So the goal isn't education. It's actually, well, it's judgment. Okay, so that's already a pretty radical idea, but now let's move on to our second point, the case of the missing parables. Because when we start to look at the historical evidence, this whole thing gets even stranger. So first, let's just get our timeline straight. The earliest Christian writings we have are the letters from the Apostle Paul, from around the 50s. The Gospel of Mark doesn't show up until maybe 20 years later, around 70 CE. And then other Gospels, like John, come even later. So Paul is our first witness, by a long shot.
Okay, so with that in mind, here's the bombshell. How many parables does Paul quote in all of his letters? The answer is 0, a big fat 0. Our earliest Christian writer, the guy who wrote a huge chunk of the New Testament, never once mentions a parable. Not one.
And it's not like he didn't have the chance. Scholar Richard Carey points out this perfect example in the book of Romans. Paul is talking about whether you should pay taxes to the Roman government. I mean, come on, a parable about rendering unto Caesar would have been the perfect thing to quote, right? But nothing. It's like he's never even heard of it.
So this leaves us with a huge, unavoidable question. If parables were Jesus' main way of teaching, his signature move, how could Paul be completely silent about them? It just doesn't add up. His silence is absolutely deafening, and it leads to a really wild possibility. What if the parables weren't really from Jesus at all, but were actually created by the gospel writers decades after the fact?
And if you think that's a puzzle, just wait. The plot thickens even more when we start comparing the Gospels to each other. This brings us to Section 3, a tale of two Jesuses. We're not just talking about minor differences here. We're talking about direct, flat-out contradictions. So on one hand, you have Mark's Jesus, the secretive one, the one who, as we've seen, speaks in riddles and then has to pull his disciples aside to explain what he actually meant.
But then you flip over to the Gospel of John, and what does Jesus say at his trial? He says, "I have spoken openly to the world. I said nothing in secret." I mean, those two things cannot both be true. They're polar opposites. One Jesus is all about secrets, the other says he has none.
And believe me, it's not just about their teaching styles. This contradiction cuts way deeper, right to the absolute core of Christian theology. Let's talk about forgiveness.
In the Gospel of Mark, you see Jesus forgiving sins directly, on the spot. Remember the story of the paralyzed man? Jesus just says, "Your sins are forgiven." Boom, done. This is all happening before the crucifixion. But then you look at the theology that Paul developed, and it's completely different. For Paul, there is no forgiveness without the shedding of blood. His death is what makes forgiveness possible. So, which is it? Does Jesus forgive sins before he dies? Or does he have to die for forgiveness to even be a thing? So, what do we do with all this? How do we unravel this theological mystery? Because we're not just talking about slightly different versions of the same story. We're looking at completely different Jesuses with totally different missions.
If you lay it all out, you see these incredibly distinct portraits. Mark's gospel gives us the secretive prophet whose job is to conceal the truth from outsiders. The Gospel of John gives us this grand cosmic figure, the Logos, who comes to openly reveal truth. And then Paul's letters give us the sacrificial Redeemer, whose entire purpose is to die for sins. It seems like each author, each community, was crafting a version of Jesus that made sense for them.
And what this all points to is that the New Testament isn't a single, unified biography. It's more like a mosaic. It's a collection of different voices from different communities, all wrestling with who Jesus was and what he meant over decades. So these contradictions, they aren't mistakes. They're a feature, not a bug. They actually show us the process of theology being born and evolving over time.
Okay, so this brings us to our final section. Why does any of this matter? Because digging into this parable problem isn't just some dusty academic game. It actually unlocks a much, much deeper way of understanding these texts.
So, to sum it all up, the parable problem reveals these fascinating fault lines in the New Testament. It shows us that even the most central Christian ideas, like how forgiveness works, weren't set in stone from day one. They evolved. The parables are like a gateway, a way into seeing how early Christianity was this complex, messy, and creative process. The authors weren't writing biography. They were creating theology for their people right then and there.
And that really leaves us with one last big question to chew on. When you see this messy, complicated, very human process behind the text, does that make it less divine, or does it make it something else? Something maybe more profoundly and interestingly human? That's something for you to think about.